The air still smells of what was breathing at dawn. Smoke from burning thatch pushes into her eyes, but she can see her father slumped near the cattle pen. One arm bent the wrong way. A language she has never tasted before snaps over her head, harsh and clipped. The rope at her wrists is stiff. Someone else sweated into it yesterday. She is 15. She had a name this morning. By sundown, that name will be Ash, the same as the walls of her village. This is not the start of a journey. This is the last hour of her world. That girl, reduced to a circle of black ground and a length of dirty rope, is one entry in a ledger 13 centuries long. The figure is hard to hold in the mind. Around 14 million human beings dragged from sub-Saharan Africa into the Ottoman Empire and the wider Arab world. A trade that began before the Atlantic ships were ever built and kept moving long after they stopped. But here is the question that should keep you awake. The Atlantic trade left 45 million descendants across the Americas, living proof that people survived, married, raised children, remembered. So, where are the descendants of this older, longer trade? Where are the tens of millions who should be walking the streets of Cairo, Baghdad, Istanbul, Riyadh today? The silence is the answer. This was not a story of survival. This was a story of erasure, carried out with patience. What you are about to hear was not an accident, not a side effect of an economy. It was a machine, built on purpose, tuned over centuries, designed to swallow not only labor, but bloodlines. In the next hour, we open that machine and lay the parts on the table. 3 pillars held it up. The commodification of the body, which turned a human being into a price written in ink. The war for the womb, which turned motherhood into a tool of assimilation. And the engineering of the demographic ghost, the final move that wiped millions from the record, as if they had never drawn breath. Before we step down into this, we want to know who is walking in with us. Drop the city and country you are watching from in the comments. If you believe these stories deserve to be spoken out loud, hit subscribe and stand with this project. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The journey began the moment a life ended. For millions, the first proving ground was the Sahara, a furnace that culled long before the markets ever opened their gates. This was not a road. It was a filter, written into the geography itself. Columns of hundreds, sometimes thousands, were driven north under armed guard. Neck to neck on a single rope, a moving chain of bodies that stretched from the Sahel grasslands all the way to the shore of the Mediterranean. The route was old. By the year AD 652, the Bakhti Treaty signed between the Arab governor of Egypt, Abdallah ibn Sa'd, and the Christian kingdom of Makria already required an annual delivery of 360 slaves to Cairo. That single agreement set the rhythm for a trade that would run for over 1,000 years. Water was not a kindness. It was a tool, rationed not to keep people alive, but to keep cargo arriving. Anyone who stumbled and could not rise was cut loose from the line with a knife stroke. Their body stayed where it dropped, half curled in the sand, soon stripped by vultures and jackals. Later caravans used those bones as signposts. The British explorer James Richardson walked one of these tracks in 1845, the route through Ghadames, Ghat, and Fezzan. What he wrote in his journal never left him. The trail was paved with skeletons, so many that travelers no longer bothered to count. He described the small bones of children, polished white by sun and wind, lying beside the larger bones of women he assumed were their mothers. He counted the corpses for a single day's march and recorded the figures in his notebook. The numbers climbed past 100 before noon. The German explorer Gustav Nachtigall, crossing the same desert in 1869, described caravans where the dead were simply unhitched from the chain and left sitting upright, as if resting, because the slavers did not want to slow the column to dig graves. None of this was a malfunction. It was the design. The slavers knew their math. A fixed percentage would die before the markets of Cairo, Tripoli, and Merzuk. That loss was already written into the profit margin. The desert took the sick, the old, the slow, the pregnant. What walked out the other side had passed the first inspection without the merchants lifting a finger. Quality control, performed by thirst and heat. The medieval traveler Ibn Battuta, who joined a caravan from Sijil Masa across the western Sahara in 1352, described the journey with the same tone he used for weather. Discomfort, expected losses. A guide who knew the wells. The captives in his column were not even worth naming in his account. The same equation ran across salt water. From the Swahili coast, captives were stacked into the bellies of wooden dhows bound for Zanzibar, the ports of Oman, the slave markets of Persia, and the Red Sea. The cargo holds were not designed for people. People were forced to fit them. Bodies pressed against bodies in spaces too low to sit upright. Weeks lying in their own waste. Air came in thin gusts through cracks between the planks. Food was a fistful of dates, sometimes boiled millet. Water turned green in the wooden barrels by the third day. Dysentery, scurvy, smallpox moved through the hull in hours. The British naval officer Captain Colomb, patrolling the Indian Ocean in the 1860s aboard HMS Dryad, boarded captured dhows and recorded what he found. Children stacked in tiers like loaves on a baker's shelf. Bodies still chained to the dead. Sharks learned to follow the dhows so closely that crews could throw a corpse over the rail without slowing the sail. When a captive died, the body went over the side without a word. Cheaper than medicine. Cheaper than time. In the receiving ports, a dhow that arrived with half its human cargo still breathing was logged as a successful voyage. The merchant Tipu Tip, the most powerful Swahili slave trader of the 19th century and an associate of the Sultan of Zanzibar, built an empire that stretched from the coast deep into the Congo Basin, all of it financed by this calculus. The survivors had endured starvation, dehydration, and disease in one chamber. That endurance raised their price. The crossing itself was part of the appraisal. This was not a random sweep of human beings. It was a targeted hunt, shaped by specific buyer demand recorded in ink. The account books of these merchants read like procurement manuals for livestock. There was a hierarchy, and every raider knew it by heart. At the top sat the women of the Ethiopian highlands and the Horn of Africa, called in Arab sources Habesha or Al-Habash, lighter skin, narrower features, a look the market labeled less African. Their bodies were priced 3 to 4 times higher than women taken from Nilotic or Bantu populations. The 9th century writer Al-Jahiz, in his treatise Risala fi Manakib al-Turk, ranked the perceived qualities of enslaved peoples like a wine catalogue. Persian traders did the same in their manuals on slave purchase. One 11th century guide, written by Ibn Butlan in Baghdad, advised buyers on how to read the temperament of an enslaved woman by the shape of her eyes and the curve of her neck. That price differential rewired the violence. Raids were not scattered. They were aimed. Whole campaigns were launched into specific valleys for the sole purpose of seizing those particular women. The Galla Wars in the Ethiopian borderlands, the Funj raids along the Blue Nile, the slaving expeditions launched out of Khartoum by Egyptian governors under Muhammad Ali in the 1820s, all of them followed the price chart. Demand for a luxury good produced a hunt for a luxury good. The arrows did not fall at random. They fell where the ledger said the highest margins waited. The psychological war started the instant the first rope was knotted. The most refined tool the slavers carried was not a chain. It was the deliberate destruction of family. This was not a tragic byproduct. It was the opening move. At the inland collection points, the zaribas built of thorn bush in the southern Sudan, families were broken apart with method. A mother torn from her son. She went north with one caravan, he went east with another. The Austrian missionary Father Daniel Comboni, working along the Upper Nile in the 1860s, described watching mothers tear at their own hair as their children were dragged away in separate directions, the sound of their wailing still in his ears years later when he wrote his reports to Rome. Sisters who had shared the same sleeping mat all their lives were separated, their last glimpse of each other a face vanishing into dust. Husbands and wives were split, every plan for a shared old age erased in a single transaction. None of this was accidental. An isolated person is easier to control than a family. A person who has lost everyone is a person whose resistance has already been hollowed out. The slavers were not only merchants, they were practitioners of applied cruelty. They understood that you do not break a body first. You break the bonds that hold the body to the world. By the time the auction block came into view, the dehumanization was weeks old. Every tie of blood, love, and community had been targeted on purpose. The goal was to deliver a solitary, terrified unit to the market, scrubbed of the people who had once spoken its name. The Sudanese historian Naum Shukayr, writing in 1903, listed the standard practices of the slave caravans crossing from Darfur to Asyut, and described the separation of mothers and children as a formal step in the journey, listed alongside the rationing of grain. The destination for those who survived was a place like Zanzibar. By the middle of the 19th century, this small island off the coast of what is now Tanzania had become the central node of the East African slave trade, a human processing plant disguised as a port town. Under the rule of Sultan Said, who moved the capital of Oman from Muscat to Zanzibar in 1840, the island became the wealthiest port on the East African coast. Clove plantations on Pemba, ivory caravans from the interior, and human cargo from the lakes region all funneled through the same customs house on the harbor front. The Scottish missionary David Livingstone walked through it in 1866 and wrote down what he saw, and his account refuses every comfortable myth about the era. He did not describe chaos. He described paperwork. He described routine. He estimated that for every captive who reached the coast alive, 4 or 5 had died on the inland march from the Great Lakes. The architecture itself worked toward dehumanization. The slave market stood at the heart of Stone Town, in the shadow of the Sultan's palace. Captives were funneled into holding pens beneath the buildings, open-air enclosures for some, underground cells for others, cut directly into the coral rock, ceilings so low that an adult could not stand. The chambers Livingstone described still exist beneath the Anglican cathedral that was later built on the site of the market, finished in 1879 on the orders of Bishop Edward Steer, the altar placed precisely where the whipping post had stood. The captives sat in those cells for days, sometimes weeks. They were sorted by age, by sex, by perceived ethnic origin. They were fed enough to round out their faces. Their skin was rubbed with palm oil to hide sores and rope burns. They were being staged like furniture before a showroom opens. Livingstone saw rows of men, women, and children chained to posts in the public square, their eyes gone somewhere far away. He heard the auctioneers, voices flat, listing attributes the way a grain trader lists weights and grades. The air carried the smell of clove and sweat, and the salt wind off the harbor. Dogs lay panting in the shade of the customs sheds. Somewhere, a muezzin called the noon prayer. The auctions continued through it. There was no shouting, no visible hatred, only commerce, performed with administrative calm. That calm was the worst part of it. The final step in turning a person into a product happened on the platform. The physical inspection. Clinical, invasive, designed to strip the last shred of personhood. A buyer would step up to a woman on the stand. He would force her mouth open and run a finger along her teeth and gums to estimate her age, the same gesture a man uses on a horse at market in Muscat or Basra. He would pinch the meat of her arms and calves for muscle tone. He would order her to walk, to turn, to lift her arms. Scars on the back were treated as a defect. A scarred back suggested a will that had fought back before. That lowered the price. The woman was stripped naked in the open. Dozens of eyes moved over her skin, looking for disease, for blemishes, for anything that would reduce her value as labor or as a concubine. For the highest-priced women, especially the young Ethiopian girls sold as virgins, the inspection went further. An older enslaved woman, kept by the household for this exact purpose, would perform a crude examination on behalf of the buyer to confirm virginity. The 11th century manual of Ibn Butlan described this procedure in clinical prose, as if discussing how to inspect a horse for soundness of hoof. A confirmed virgin could double or triple in price. The most private part of a girl's body became a line item in a ledger written in Arabic, Persian, or Ottoman Turkish. On that platform, in that minute, a human being stopped existing. What stood there now was a list of attributes. Age read from teeth. Health read from flesh. Compliance estimated from the smoothness of her back. Sexual value certified by a stranger's hand. It is hard, from inside the modern world, to absorb the scale and the coldness of this. We tend to picture historical atrocity as a thing of mobs and fire, driven by rage. This was something else. This was organized, rational in its own way. The men who ran these caravans, these dhows, these markets, were not merely brutes. They were operators. They kept careful ledgers in Arabic script, Swahili, Persian. They tracked profit and loss per head. They understood routes, monsoon seasons, currencies, exchange rates between the Maria Theresa thaler used on the coast and the rupee used in the Indian markets. The path of that Ethiopian girl, from the day her village burned to the morning she stood on the Zanzibar block, ran through a sophisticated economic logic shared across half the known world. Her youth, her health, her face, her virginity, each one a variable, each one a number. She was an asset, and the journey she had survived was a long process of asset management, tuned to maximize the return on investment for the men who claimed her. This is the foundation of the entire machine. Before you can build a gilded cage, before you can wage a war on the womb, before you can vanish millions from the historical record, you have to first sell a single idea. You have to convince the world, and the captive, that she is not a person. She is a thing with a price. Telling these stories with the depth they deserve is the whole point of this channel. Months of research go into a single episode. Obscure archives, untranslated sources, ledgers no one has looked at in a century. None of this is fast, and none of it is cheap. If this work matters to you, if you feel these are the stories that have to be spoken, there is a way to step closer. We built a membership for the viewers who want to stand inside this project, not just watch it from the outside. We call it the lineage. Joining the lineage means you are no longer only an audience member. You are a patron of the investigations. You make sure the next documentary gets made at the level the subject demands. You become one of us, an insider, a historian, helping pull these truths out of the dark. You also get early access to every new film before it goes public. If you feel you belong with us, take your place. The link is in the description. The inspection ends. A figure is agreed. Maria Theresa Thalers, minted in faraway Vienna and used as currency across the Indian Ocean, move from one hand to another. The girl is pulled off the platform, fresh chains snapped onto her wrists. She is led away from the noise of the market, through narrow alleys that smell of fish and cardamom and smoke from cooking fires, past walls of coral stone bleached white by salt. Carved wooden doors line the lanes, each one studded with brass to ward off elephants that had never set foot on the island. Above her, latticed mashrabia screens hide the faces of women looking down from upper floors. She is led toward a high stone wall set with a single heavy wooden door, deeper and darker than the others. The door swings inward on iron hinges that have not been oiled in years. Beyond it, a courtyard she could never have pictured. A fountain in the center. Tile work she does not recognize. The door closes behind her with a sound like a stone being rolled across a tomb. She does not yet understand what kind of place she has entered. A place where survival itself is the instrument of erasure. A place where the only way to keep breathing is to let everything she ever was be ground down to nothing. Her village, her language, her God, her mother's name. All of it scheduled for deletion. Somewhere above her, a woman is watching from a screened window, judging her, already calculating where in the household she will be placed and what name she will be given. And the first lesson is about to begin. The word harem still carries a perfume of silk pillows, scented oils, and forbidden romance. That perfume was sprayed on by European painters and novelists who had never stepped through the door. Jean-Léon Gérôme, painting his odalisques in Paris in the 1860s, had never seen the inside of Topkapi. Ingres, who painted La Grande Odalisque in 1814, worked from his imagination and from prints. The image of the lounging concubine sold well in the salons of Europe and shaped what the West believed about the Ottoman world for 200 years. The truth on the other side of that door was a cage, the imperial harem of the Ottomans, the destination for the most expensive women shipped north through Cairo and Istanbul, was not a palace of pleasure. It was a sealed vault, a political snake pit, and a slow machine for taking a human being apart and reassembling her into an instrument of the state. It was beautiful. It was opulent. It was suffocating. The walls of the Topkapi Palace, built on the headland above the Golden Horn after Mehmed II conquered Constantinople in 1453, glowed with Iznik tiles fired in cobalt blue and tomato red in the kilns of western Anatolia. The floors were buried under Persian carpets thick enough to swallow a footstep. Cypress trees rose in the second courtyard, their shadows moving slowly across the stone. The smell inside the women's quarters was a layered thing. Rose water from the basins, charcoal smoke from the braziers, sweat from bodies pressed together in close dormitories, the salt wind off the Bosphorus pushing through latticed screens. For the hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000 women inside, those walls were the limit of the world. The harem occupied roughly 400 rooms in the palace, sealed behind the carriage gate. The complex grew over the centuries. Suleiman the Magnificent expanded it in the 16th century, at the insistence of his wife Hurrem, who moved the women's quarters into the palace proper, breaking with the older tradition that kept them in a separate building called the Old Palace. Once a woman passed through the carriage gate, she would in most cases never pass back out. This was her geography for the rest of her life. The destruction of identity began before her bedding was assigned. The name her mother had given her, the syllables her family had used to call her in from the fields, was taken from her on the first day. It was discarded like a torn shawl. In its place, the chief stewardess of the harem, the Kahya Kadın, assigned her a new name written into the palace registers in Ottoman Turkish script with a reed pen dipped in iron gall ink. The names were chosen for their sweetness on the tongue. Gulnar, pomegranate flower; Lalizar, tulip garden; Nergis, daffodil; Hurrem, the joyful one, the name given to the Ruthenian girl Roxolana before she became the most powerful woman in 16th century Europe as the legal wife of Suleiman, a status no concubine had held in the dynasty for over a century. The new name was not paperwork. It was a declaration of ownership. The old name belonged to a girl whose existence was now officially closed. Her language went next. The tongue she had learned as a child, the language of her grandmother's lullabies, was forbidden inside the harem walls. Speaking it drew a beating from the eunuch overseers, delivered with a thin rod of pomegranate wood across the soles of the feet. She had to learn Ottoman Turkish, the language of her masters, fast enough to obey orders in it. Older women in the dormitories drilled the new arrivals in the first essential phrases. "Yes, mistress, at once. Forgive me." Then her religion. She was pushed, by force or by the slower force of social exclusion, to convert to Islam. To refuse was to remain a permanent outsider, with no path to anything except scrubbing floors until she died of overwork. The conversion ceremony was simple, the repetition of the Shahada in front of witnesses. A new name in the register, sometimes a second new name. In a matter of weeks, the three pillars of who she had been, her name, her tongue, her God, were knocked out from under her. She was being unmade on purpose. A blank surface, prepared so that the will of the Sultan could be written on it without interference. This new world ran on a strict pyramid. At the top sat the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan. She held court in her own apartments, controlled vast personal estates that included whole villages in Anatolia, and often shaped imperial policy from behind the lattice. Kösem Sultan, born a Greek girl named Anastasia on the island of Tinos around 1589, the daughter of a parish priest, was sold into the palace as a child. She became the favorite of Ahmed IV, then Valid to two sultans, Murad IV and Ibrahim, and effectively ruled the empire through the regency of her grandson Mehmed IV. On the night of September 2, 1651, she was hunted through the corridors of the harem by court eunuchs aligned with a rival faction. They found her hiding in a cupboard. They strangled her with the curtain cord of her own bedchamber. She was 62 years old. That is what the top of the pyramid looked like, and even there the floor could open beneath you. Below the Valide sat the Sultan's official wives, the Kadins. Below them, the Iqbals, women who had shared the Sultan's bed and held his favor. Below them, the Gozdes, those in the eye, novices who had drawn a single glance and were being watched. And below all of these, a silent ocean of Karis, domestic servants who would never meet the Sultan in their lives. This is where the Ethiopian girl entered, servant to the servants. She carried water from the cisterns in copper jugs that left bruises on her hips. She emptied chamber pots at dawn. She fed charcoal into the braziers that warmed the upper apartments. She laundered linen in cold water that cracked her knuckles open. She slept on a mattress on the floor of a long dormitory with 30 other women, listening to coughs, prayers, and the muffled crying of new arrivals. She was surrounded by hundreds of other women, every one of them locked in the same pyramid, every one of them a competitor. The architecture of the place encouraged this. Long, narrow corridors, narrow doorways, courtyards walled by screens, spy holes in the upper walls where the eunuchs could observe without being seen. You were always being watched and never alone. The chief black eunuch, the Kuzlar Ayasu, kept a network of informants among the servants. By the late 17th century, he had grown into one of the most powerful officials in the entire empire, controlling vast charitable endowments and the appointment of judges in Mecca and Medina. He could ruin a woman with a single word. Friendships were dangerous. Alliances were transactional and short. The only direction that mattered was up, and the only ladder upward ran through the Sultan's bedchamber. This was the central cruelty of the system. A woman's womb was the single path to power, and the same womb was the instrument by which her ancestry would be deleted. The most coveted prize was pregnancy by the Sultan, and the most coveted version of that prize was a son. A concubine who delivered a son was promoted to Walad, an Arabic legal status meaning mother of a child. Teeth. She could no longer be sold. Her daily stipend, paid in silver akçe and recorded in ledgers kept by the chief treasurer, increased. She was given her own apartments, sometimes with a view of the Bosphorus through a screened window. She was assigned her own servants, often drawn from the same dormitory she had just escaped. She was no longer an anonymous face. She was the mother of a possible heir to a throne that ruled from Algiers to Baghdad, from Buda to Basra. The competition for that promotion turned the harem into a quiet battlefield. Women trained for years in the skills that might catch a single glance. They learned to play the oud and the kanun and the ney. They memorized verses of Hafez and Rumi and Fuzuli. They studied the slow steps of dances passed down through generations of palace teachers from the school in the old palace. They were trained the way racehorses are trained, for a single race that most of them would never run. The Venetian Bello Ottaviano Bon, who left a detailed account of the palace after his mission to Istanbul between 1604 and 1607, described the rigorous schooling the women received in music, embroidery, calligraphy, and the etiquette of the court. He described the silence that fell over a room when the Sultan walked through the dormitory and the chief stewardess presented selected women for his consideration. He noted that the Sultan would drop a handkerchief at the feet of the woman he had chosen for the night. That gesture, the handkerchief on the floor, could change the trajectory of an entire life. The competition did not stop at music and verse. It bled into politics, faction, and poison. Women aligned themselves with ethnic groups, with the chief black eunuch who controlled access to the Sultan's bedchamber, or with the chief white eunuch who controlled the outer service of the palace. They spied on each other. They whispered to the laundresses and the cooks and the women who carried trays of sherbet from the imperial kitchens. A pregnant rival was a marked woman. The Ottoman historian Mustafa Naima, writing in the early 18th century, described court factions splitting along the lines of which prince's mother had paid which official. Accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe substances slipped into sherbets to force miscarriages, powdered savin, brewed rue, doses of mercury hidden in sugared almonds. Food destined for a favored cadon was tasted first by enslaved girls, who sometimes died on the floor of the kitchens for the chance of a poisoning. The children themselves were not safe. Mehmed II had codified the law of fratricide in his Kanunum in the 1470s, the law that permitted a new sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil war. When Mehmed III took the throne in 1595, after the death of his father Murad III, he ordered 19 of his half-brothers strangled in a single afternoon. They were strangled with a silk cord by deaf-mute executioners trained for this purpose, because the cord did not spill royal blood on the ground, which was forbidden by tradition. The boys, some of them only children, were buried in 19 small coffins beside their father in the Hagia Sophia complex. The mothers of those 19 boys had spent years climbing the pyramid only to watch their sons walk past them into the executioner's room. After that bloodbath, the political weather shifted. Ahmed I, who came to the throne in 1603, refused to kill his younger brother Mustafa. The system moved to the kafes, the cage, a sealed apartment in the harem complex, where unwanted princes were locked away for years, sometimes decades. Mustafa I spent 14 years in the kafes and emerged so unstable that the court deposed him twice. Ibrahim, son of Qasim, spent 22 years in the cage before being pulled out to become sultan in 1640. By then, he was so broken that the court physicians had to be summoned to confirm he understood what a throne was. The mothers of princes lived inside this calculation. Every meal, every visitor, every overheard word was weighed against the chance their son might wake up the next morning, or might not. Behind the gardens and the marble fountains of the courtyard of the favorites, this was the daily weather. A quiet war fought with whispers, herbs, and timed seductions, where the battlefield was the sultan's bedchamber, and the prize was the right to keep breathing. And yet, even winning was a defeat. Picture our Ethiopian girl, now entered in the registers as Gulnar. She survives the dormitory years. She learns the language well enough to recite a couplet from Fuzuli without an accent. She masters the yud. She catches the sultan's eye on a summer evening when he passes through the second courtyard on his way back from the privy chamber. The handkerchief drops at her feet. She is summoned. She becomes pregnant. Against every probability, she carries the child to term in a birthing room watched over by midwives from the palace staff. She delivers a son. She is now Walad. She has reached the highest rung available to a woman of her origin. She is safe in a way she has not been since the day her village burned. Her son is a prince of the House of Osman, heir to a dynasty that has ruled for more than 3 centuries by this point. But the victory itself completes the erasure. Her son will not be raised as an Afro-Turk. He will not learn a word of her language. He will not hear the stories her own mother told her by the cooking fire. He will be raised inside the Shehzadi apartments by tutors selected from the most learned scholars of the empire, men trained in the madrasis of Istanbul and Bursa. He will be taught Arabic for theology, Persian for poetry, Ottoman Turkish for statecraft, and the Quran by memory. He will study horsemanship in the third courtyard with the imperial pages. He will learn the names of his Ottoman ancestors back to Osman Gazi, the founder of the dynasty who died around 1324. He will not learn the name of his African grandmother. His identity will be assembled entirely from his father's world. He will look at his mother and see, at best, a beloved figure of his childhood. He will not see Ethiopia. He will not see the highland villages, or the language of Ge'ez, or the saints of the Ethiopian Orthodox calendar painted on the walls of churches carved out of solid rock. Gulnar will become a footnote in the genealogies kept by the court historians, perhaps listed by her palace name, perhaps marked only as Kari, with no name at all. Her bloodline will pour into the imperial river, and the river will carry no trace of where her drop originated. She will not be the founder of a lineage of her own. She will be the biological vessel through which her master's lineage continued for one more generation. This was the deal the harem offered every woman who entered it. Trade your name, your language, your God, your people, your past, every connection to the world that made you. In return, receive a fragile place inside a gilded cage, and, in the same gesture, become the instrument by which your own people disappear from the record. The book that opened the inner workings of this system for our research is one of the most important pieces of macabre scholarship ever written on the harem. It strips away the Orientalist fantasy and lays bare the machinery underneath, the registers, the stipends, the punishments, the slow consumption of identity. It was the primary source for the script you are listening to right now. If you want to go deeper than this video can take you, you need this book on your shelf. Tap the View Products button on your screen right now. The book is waiting on the ancestral shop shelf. Beside it, we have curated a small collection of dark relics tied to the worlds we explore, pieces meant to live in your hands, not just on your screen. Open the shelf now and see what is waiting for you while the story continues. The son grows. He becomes a prince with his own household, his own retainers, his own teachers of falconry and rhetoric. His mother, the former captive from the Ethiopian highlands, watches from the screened windows of her apartments above the second courtyard. She may glimpse him during a procession on a feast day, mounted on a small horse in a green silk kaftan. She may hear his name announced at a ceremony she is not allowed to attend. She is no longer the dominant voice in his life. He belongs to the empire. He is a Turk. He is an Ottoman. If he survives the political weather and is not strangled with a silk cord or locked in the cafes, he may one day marry a Circassian noblewoman from the Caucasus or the daughter of a powerful pasha from Damascus. Their children will be one more generation removed from the highlands where his grandmother was born. By the third generation, the physical traces will have thinned almost to nothing, dissolved into the population of the empire that stretched from the Atlas Mountains to the Caspian Sea. The system was engineered to do exactly this. It was not designed to create a hybrid culture, a recognizable Afro-Ottoman identity with its own music, language, neighborhoods, festivals, saints, and writers. There is no such culture in modern Turkey, in modern Egypt, in modern Iraq. It was designed to absorb and dissolve. The woman's purpose was fulfilled the moment she delivered a son to her master. After that, her ancestry was scheduled for slow deletion across the generations that followed. But the harem was only the inner chamber of the machine. Outside its walls, in the back streets of Cairo and Damascus and Baghdad, in the small households of merchants and minor officials across the wider Islamic world, a second mechanism was running in parallel. A mechanism that did not require a sultan or a palace. A mechanism that handled the millions of captives who would never see Topkapi, who would never have a son, who would never even reach the auction blocks of Istanbul. For them, a different fate had been prepared in advance, written into the law books and into the custom of every household that owned them. It involved a knife, it involved a small room behind the kitchen, and it left no descendants at all. We arrive at the central riddle. 14 million people, moved across 13 centuries, fed into a system that reached from the forests south of Lake Chad to the marble palaces of Istanbul, from the highlands of Ethiopia to the rice fields of Persia, from the Swahili coast to the date plantations of southern Iraq. Today, their demographic footprint is almost invisible. There is no large Afro-Turkish population walking the streets of Istanbul. There is no Afro-Iraqi community in Baghdad of comparable scale to the African-American community in the United States. There is no Afro-Egyptian neighborhood in Cairo with its own newspapers, schools, and political representatives. The question is not only what happened, the question is how it happened so completely. This was not a slow drift of assimilation. It was an engineered process, built from 3 interlocking parts, each one solving a different piece of the same equation. Together, they produced a result so clean that the loudest evidence of the system today is its own silence. The first pillar was a direct attack on the future of the African man. Women were brought north in vast numbers for domestic service, sexual exploitation, and the production of heirs for their masters. A significant share of the captured men, especially boys taken between the ages of 7 and 12, were assigned a different fate. They were to be made into eunuchs. Castration was not a side practice. It was a core feature of the trade, written into demand, priced into the markets, anticipated in the contracts that linked the raiders of the African interior to the buyers of the imperial capitals. Eunuchs were needed to guard the harems, to manage the inner palaces, to serve the women of noble households without the legal or social risk of contact between free women and intact men. The procedure was carried out at specific staging points along the trade routes, locations chosen because the local population had reasons to perform an act that Islamic law itself prohibited. The Coptic monastery at Abu Gerj in Upper Egypt, on the western bank of the Nile, was one of the most notorious centers. The operation was performed there by Coptic Christian monks, who were not bound by the Islamic ban on castration. The English traveler William Brown, who passed through Egypt in the 1790s, described the monks performing the procedure on consignments of boys delivered up the Nile from the slave markets of Asyut. The town of Bagirmi, southeast of Lake Chad, in what is now Chad, was another major center, supplying eunuchs to the Ottoman markets through the trans-Saharan routes that crossed Fezzan. A third center operated at Hausa-controlled towns in the central Sudan, supplying the eastern Arab markets through Darfur. The boys were cut with razors honed on leather strips. Some practitioners removed only the testicles, producing what the markets called sandali eunuchs. Others removed the entire genital apparatus in a single stroke, producing the majbub, who commanded the highest prices and the highest mortality. The wounds were cauterized with boiling oil pressed against the open flesh, or the boys were buried up to the waist in hot desert sand for days while the wounds closed under pressure. The screams from the chambers where this was performed could be heard, according to multiple 19th-century travelers, half a mile away on still nights. The mortality rate was catastrophic. The German explorer Gustav Nachtigall, who passed through Bagirmi in 1873 and spoke directly with the operators, reported that out of every 10 boys subjected to the procedure, only 1 or 2 survived the infection that followed. The Italian explorer Romolo Gessi, who served under Charles Gordon in the Sudan in the 1870s, described corpses piled outside the operating chambers at the rate of dozens per week during the peak shipping seasons. The survivors were worth their weight in gold. By the 19th century, a healthy young eunuch could fetch 8 to 10 times the price of an intact male slave in the markets of Cairo and Mecca. A trained palace eunuch sold to the Ottoman court could command a price equal to several hundred ordinary captives combined. The math worked because demand never slackened. The chief black eunuch of the Ottoman imperial harem, the Kuzlar Ayası, was by the late 17th century one of the 5 most powerful officials in the entire empire. Mehmed Agha, who held the post under Murad III in the 1580s, controlled the imperial endowments for the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and could make or unmake grand viziers with a single conversation. Behind every official like him stood the buried evidence of the system that produced him. The boys who did not survive were dropped into shallow trenches outside the towns where they had been operated on. Their names were not recorded in any register. Their families in the interior never learned what happened to them. The vultures that circled Bagirmi and Abu Gerg during the shipping season were noted by every European traveler who passed through. Every survivor was a man who would never father a child. Every castration was a genetic full stop, a closed line on a ledger that would never reopen. While the wombs of African women were being used to extend the bloodlines of their masters, the reproductive capacity of African men was being deleted with erasure. There would be no parallel African patriarchy growing inside the empire to challenge the dominant one. There would be no second generation rooted in fathers who had survived the journey north. The continuity of the African male line was severed at the source. The second pillar was the absorption of the children. We saw the mechanism inside the imperial harem with the legal status of Walad. The principle ran far beyond the palace walls. It operated in every merchant's house in Damascus, every bey's residence in Tunis, every minor official's compound in Mosul. Across the wider Islamic world, in every household where an enslaved woman bore a child by her free master, the same rule applied. The child was born free. The child belonged to the father. The mother could not be sold while the child lived, and she became free upon her master's death. On its surface, this looks more humane than the chattel system of the Americas, where the child of an enslaved woman was born into bondage with no exit and could be sold away from her at any age. In demographic terms, it was the opposite. It was a faster, cleaner mechanism of erasure. The American system preserved a community by walling it off. The Islamic system dissolved a community by absorbing it. The freeborn child was not raised with any link to the mother's origin. The father and his family held complete authority over the child's name, education, and identity. The child was given an Arabic, Turkish, or Persian name written into the household register and into the local qadi's court records. They were raised speaking the language of the dominant culture. They were instructed in Islam by tutors hired by the father. They learned the histories of their father's people, the genealogies that traced his line back to a real or imagined ancestor of standing, sometimes back to a companion of the prophet himself. The African mother was, at her best, a beloved figure in their early years. She was never a source of cultural identity. She could not pass on her language without inviting punishment from the senior women of the household, often the master's free wife or his mother. She could not pass on her religion because the child was Muslim from birth by law. She could not pass on the stories of her own people because there was no one in the household who would have understood them or allowed them to be told. The Andalusian jurist Ibn Hazm, writing in the 11th century, described the standard expectation that the Walad would conform completely to her master's household culture and would not transmit any element of her origin to the child she had born. The legal structure reinforced this at every level. The Hanafi school of jurisprudence, dominant across most of the Ottoman Empire, treated the freeborn child as a full member of the father's lineage, with full inheritance rights, while granting the mother no recognized standing as a transmitter of ancestry. The Maliki school, dominant in North Africa, operated on the same principle with minor variations. The Shafi'i school, dominant in Egypt and parts of Arabia, agreed. The matrilineal channel through which culture normally flows from one generation to the next was closed by law, by custom, and by the architecture of the household itself, where the women's quarters were physically and socially separated from the spaces where the children were taught their letters and their genealogies. The system was engineered to cut the cord at the moment of birth and to replace one inheritance with another. Within a single generation, the African half of the child's ancestry was reduced to a biological fact without cultural meaning. This leads to the third pillar, and to where the design of the system becomes hardest to look at directly: the dilution of bloodlines. The Atlantic world built a wall around African ancestry through laws like the one-drop rule, codified across the southern United States in statutes such as the Virginia Racial Integrity Act of 1924 which defined any traceable African ancestry as black and pushed those people into a separate caste. The result, by accident of cruelty, was the preservation of a distinct community with a continuous memory of itself, with its own churches, its own music, its own writers, its own political movements. The Ottoman and Arab systems worked in the opposite direction. There was no rigid racial caste designed to keep the descendants of enslaved Africans separate. There were prejudices, sometimes severe ones, recorded in poetry and in legal opinions, but there was no legal structure designed to wall the descendants off. The goal was the reverse. The goal was to fold them in until nothing distinct remained. The free-born son of an African concubine and an Ottoman master grew up as an Ottoman. He took his father's name, his father's faith, his father's profession, or his father's military rank. When his family arranged his marriage, they did not seek a bride among other descendants of African women. There was no recognized pool of such women to seek a bride from. They sought a daughter from a respectable Turkish, Arab, Circassian, Bosnian, or Albanian family of comparable social standing. His children were 1/4 African by descent. Those children, in turn, married further into the general population. By the third generation, the recognizable physical features of the original African ancestor were largely gone, blended into the wider population. By the fourth, the family memory might preserve a half-remembered story of a great-great-grandmother who had come from somewhere south, with no name attached, with no place name attached, with no village or river or language remembered. That memory carried no political weight, no community attached to it, no shared identity with anyone else who might have descended from a similar woman in a similar household 3 generations earlier. The lineage was no longer African. The lineage was Ottoman, Egyptian, Iraqi, or Persian. The records of the great Cairo families compiled by 19th and 20th century genealogists rarely mention an African ancestress, even when the physical evidence in surviving portraits suggests her presence. The genealogies of the Ottoman Pasha class trace lines back through Circassian and Albanian connections in obsessive detail, while the African connections, which were demographically just as common, vanish from the page. The system did not segregate. It consumed. It created what can only be described as a demographic ghost. The genetic material remained scattered in trace fractions across the populations of 6 modern countries, detectable today only by DNA analysis of contemporary populations across Anatolia, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and Iran. Studies published in journals of population genetics over the last 2 decades have identified sub-Saharan African genetic markers in measurable percentages across these regions, present but invisible. The distinct identity, the language, the religion, the community, the shared memory, all of it had been processed out. The erasure was so thorough that it left almost no evidence of its own operation above the level of the chromosome. The combined effect of these 3 mechanisms is hard to absorb when you sit with the numbers. Castration removed the male line at the level of the body. The Walad law absorbed the children of the female line into the father's identity at the level of culture. Generational intermarriage diluted what remained until it dissolved at the level of the population. Millions entered the machine. Almost no recognizable community emerged on the other side. There is no Afro-Turkish music scene rivaling the blues or jazz of the African-American tradition. There is no Afro-Arab literary movement standing beside the literature of the African diaspora in the Caribbean and the Americas. No equivalent to Aimé Césaire or Derek Walcott or Toni Morrison rooted in the experience of this older trade. There is no national holiday of remembrance anywhere in the lands where this trade operated for over 1,000 years. The slave market of Zanzibar was abolished in 1873 under British pressure on Sultan Bargash. The Ottoman trade was formally suppressed across the late 19th century. Slavery in Saudi Arabia was officially abolished only in 1962, in Oman in 1970, in Mauritania in 1981. The dates are recent enough to be living memory. The communities of descendants who should be present today are not. The small communities that do exist are the partial exceptions that confirm the pattern. The Afro-Iraqis around Basra, who number perhaps a few 100,000 and call themselves the Zinj, descend largely from East African captives brought to work the salt marshes and date plantations of southern Mesopotamia. Some are descended from the survivors of the Zanj Rebellion, the great uprising of enslaved East Africans against the Abbasid Caliphate that lasted from AD 869 to AD 883, led by a mysterious figure named Ali ibn Muhammad, who claimed descent from the fourth caliph. The rebels seized Basra in AD 871, slaughtered tens of thousands of its inhabitants, and ran a parallel state in the southern marshes for over a decade before the Caliph al-Mu'tamid's forces under his brother al-Muwaffaq finally crushed them in AD 883 after a siege of their capital at al-Muhtara. The Afro-Turks of the Aegean coast, around Izmir and Ayvalık, are remnants of agricultural slavery in the late Ottoman period and number perhaps in the low thousands today. They held an annual spring festival called the Dana Bayramı, the Calf Festival, suppressed in the early 20th century and revived only recently as a small commemoration. The Afro-Iranians of Hormozgan and Sistan-Baluchistan survive along the southern coast where they were brought in the 18th and 19th centuries to dive for pearls in the Persian Gulf and work the ports of Bandar Abbas. They preserve a healing ceremony called the Zar, traceable to Ethiopian and Sudanese roots, performed to this day in coastal villages. The Habesha communities of Yemen carry traces of a much older Ethiopian presence on the Arabian Peninsula, going back to the Aksumite kingdom's invasion of South Arabia in the 6th century. Each of these communities exists because its ancestors were not fully processed by the central machine. They worked agriculture or manual labor at the edges of the empire, far from the inner households where the absorption mechanism operated at full strength. They were not in palaces. They were not married into the families of the master class. They preserved a fragment of identity precisely because they were left at the periphery. Their survival as visible groups today highlights, by contrast, the fate of the millions who were funneled into the center and dissolved. And so, we are left with the silence. A trade in human beings that ran for more than 1,300 years, that moved an estimated 14 million people across deserts and oceans, that built the fortunes of Cairo, Istanbul, Muscat, and Zanzibar, has left behind almost no living community of descendants speaking in its name. There are no great monuments on the scale of the slavery museums of Liverpool or Charleston. There are no annual marches. There is no equivalent to the door of no return at Gorée Island, no pilgrimage site where the descendants come back to weep. There is no annual day of remembrance recognized by the states that profited from it. The system was not only cruel, it was effective. It was designed to turn human beings into a temporary resource that would be used and then removed from the demographic record. And across 13 centuries, it did exactly that. The chains rusted away. The dhows rotted on beaches. The auction blocks of Zanzibar were paved over, and a cathedral was built on top of them. The silk cords of the imperial harem were burned. The razors of Abu Gerj were thrown in the river. The names of the 14 million were never written down in the first place. The real horror of this story is not in any single moment of cruelty. It is in the patient, methodical, successful deletion of millions of human lives from the memory of the world. The legacy of this trade is not a culture. It is not a people. It is an empty space on the map, a silence in the record, a ghost made out of arithmetic. And that silence is what this channel exists to break. One story at a time, until the empty space is no longer empty and the ghost has a name again. Thank you for staying with this investigation all the way to the end. If this story moved you, subscribe to Ancestral, leave a like on this video, and send it to one person who needs to know that this chapter of history existed. Your engagement is what keeps this work alive and lets us pull the next story out of the dark. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Now look at your screen. Another descent into the dark corners of the past is waiting for you there. Click the video. Continue the journey. It is the next required step for anyone who refuses to let history stay buried.